Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Astrid Schlörscheid, and I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor and Dean of the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences here at Oxford Brookes University. Now, one of the benefits of this lecture being online is that many more colleagues, students, and friends in the wider community are able to join us, both here and internationally, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all. I'm delighted to be introducing this year's Zuckerberg Scholarship Lecture Speech, which is entitled Israel, Tikun Olam, Healing the World Through Education and Science, which is being delivered this evening by Professor Raymond Dwek. We're expecting Raymond's talk to last about 45 minutes, leaving about 15 minutes for questions at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, just simply use the chat function during the lecture. We will gather them all up and Raymond will answer them after his talk. The annual lecture is an opportunity to celebrate the Sam Zuckerberg Scholarship. Established in 2009, this annual scholarship supports an Israeli student in completing a master's degree at Oxford Brookes University. It also aims to deepen understanding of Israel and Israelis, both within the student's peer group and the wider university. The scholarship provides a unique connection between the student and the Oxford Jewish community, who set up and originally funded the scheme. And the scholarship relies solely on the generosity of donors. So if you would like to contribute, then please go to our website for further details. And we will also share a link after the event by email. This year's scholarship recipient is Mayan Kalakuda. Mayan is studying at Oxford Brookes for a master's in international business management and entrepreneurship. Before that, she studied for a bachelor's degree in structural engineering at Ben Gurion University in Israel. She arrived in Oxford only very recently, and I'm delighted to say that Mayan is here, so I'd also like to invite her to say a few words this evening. Welcome, Mayan, and over to you.
Hello, everyone. First, thank you for having me here. It is my honor to stand here today in front of you. I don't take this opportunity for granted. Without you, I would not be able to stand here today. In this presentation, I would like to shortly introduce myself by referring to Israel as a melting pot and describing how this accompanied me during my life. Originally, I'm from a small moshav, which is a small village, in the center of Israel, called Kfar Truman, after Harry Truman, the President of the United States. My father and my grandfather are former farmers. In the upper photo, you can see my family. My family is my power. My parents always encouraged us to excel and to follow our dreams. Even my family is a great example for a melting pot. My mother comes from a religious family and my father is not. They raised us to be open-minded and encouraged us to choose our own path. Applying to high school, my parents suggested that I'll study in a high school of science because they believed that the science subjects will expand my horizons. Simultaneously, I was part of an ensemble and played the clarinet for many years. These schools are famous since they are mixed schools which located in a mixed city, Lod. It was important for my parents that we will be exposed to the diversity of cultures and opinions in our society. Both schools were mixed schools combining Jewish, Muslims, and Christians. The upper left photo was taken in a tour in which we performed in Hungary. Additionally, I was part of a youth movement called the Moshavim Youth Movement for many years. In the IDF, I served as a small unit commander that is part of the artillery division. The unit was comprised of 50 soldiers, all men. My soldiers were very diverse ethnically. I had few soldiers from many groups that Israeli society include, as you can see in the slide, Druze, Christians, Bedouin, etc. This was amazing. We used to celebrate all the holidays and we adopted a costume whereby every week a soldier talks about his tradition. This increased the sense of unity and taught the soldiers and I about different cultures. After the service, as I always enjoyed math and physics, a bachelor in structural engineering was a natural choice, even though, unfortunately, it is considered a male-dominated field. I found analyzing and designing geometric structures a complex and interesting subject. I've been working for a year in international structural engineering services company. My job focused on coordination and management of international projects. I loved it. During my studies, I thought it is good to give back to the community. As a result, I've been volunteering in a nonprofit organization named Pamonim. I guided families in financial difficulties so that they may regain their economic independence. These are some of my friends here in the Oxford Brookes University. It is a great honor to represent Israel to everyone and learning about so many different cultures. You might ask yourself why I chose to study for masters in international business management and entrepreneurship. First, I want to make a contribution to the construction industry. In Israel, it is considered to be an old-fashioned and undeveloped industry, despite the fact that it is one of the most important industries and has a huge responsibility for the development of the country's economy. I wish to return to Israel and to utilize what I'm learning at OBU to promote the industry. I want to thank the many donors from the community and of course, Roy Zuckerberg so much for supporting me to fulfill my dream to study in the UK. Last but not least, to the members of the OJC, particularly to the scholarship working group who have taken care of me from the first moment we made contact. Thank you so much for all your help. You have let me feel that I found my family in the UK. Thank you for listening. I wish to see you all in Israel.
Thank you, Mayan. We wish you all the best in your year at Brookes. And good evening, everyone. It's a great honor to give this Oxford Brookes lecture. And I'd like to start with a quotation from Matthew Gould, who was the ambassador, the UK's ambassador to Israel, when he received an honorary degree at Ben Gurion University. Everything we do, he said, is an expression of our values. And it is through our actions that we give voice to these values, like our belief in science as a potential force for good, above politics, beyond nation, that can unite and heal. So let's start with a little bit about Israel. Israel, if you look at the map of the Middle East, it's 1/6 of 1%. You could be forgiven for actually missing it when you first look at it. It is a country the size of Wales. Mark Twain visited it in 1867. He described it as a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. And he went on, it got worse and worse until he said there was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. And today, there's 9 million people, 75% Jewish and 21% Arab. It's a highly developed country with a median age of 29.7 years. And Israel is ranked in the Bloomberg Global Innovation Index, number 7 this year. And you can see, looking at the metrics that are used in research and development intensity, research and concentration, high-tech density, all of these speak to the innovative skills of Israel. So much so that Israel is called the startup nation. But in addition, Israel's science is part of Horizon Europe. They just finished signing the deal yesterday. This is the funding for Europe, for the European Union, and Israel and the UK now are being offered similar terms to be part of it. But Israel's innovation has also led to commercial success. And it's the only country in the world to have a free trade agreement with the US, Mexico, and Canada, as well as the European Union and the European Free Trade Association, all at the same time. So the question I'd like to address initially is, how has Israel used this innovation ability to develop the Negev. The Negev is 60% of Israel, but it only has 8% of the population. I've highlighted on here 3 points: Eilat, Sde Boker, and Beersheba. I've highlighted those because there are 3 campuses that Ben Gurion University has in the Negev. The one at Eilat is mainly hospitality. The one in Beersheba is the main campus. And the one at Sde Boker, which I'll say a lot about today, is about desert research. The Ottoman rulers, followed by the British authorities, considered the Negev to be uninhabitable. Its territory was mainly of strategic importance. David Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, saw things rather differently. And in 1953, he was prime minister from 48 to about 53, and then 55 to 63. He went to live in the Negev from 1953 as a personal example to try and inspire people to come and live there and to populate and develop the region. And he also wanted to have an educational institute here in the Negev. So in 1965, he founded the Institute of Higher Studies in Beersheba, which in 1969 became Ben Gurion University. And Ben Gurion himself wanted it to become a blend of Oxford and MIT. It results in a remarkable story, as I'll share with you. Ben Gurion decided to go and live in Sde Boker in the Zin Canyon. And you can see a picture of this here. His house is shown here, which he lived from 53 to 73. And he's buried at Sde Boker next to his wife, Paula. If you look at the archives, you'll see there in the archives, written in Hebrew, it says a blend of Oxford and MIT. And you may wonder why he said Oxford. And I think Ben Gurion knew Oxford rather well. He had many visits to the UK. In fact, he lived here. He lived in London between 1937 to 1938, and again in 1940. And there's a blue plaque up in Little Venice on 75 Warrington Crescent. But on his many visits to the UK, he was keen to go and visit Blackwell's bookshop as often as he could. And he'd make these trips to Blackwell's to stock up on classical texts, especially Plato. And I actually think that Plato influenced Ben Gurion's Zionism. So in his book, The Jewish Revolution, he ascribes to Plato 3 particular qualities: the qualities of activism, the qualities of unifying a people, and of a society based on justice. Interestingly, in 1960, when he was visiting Oxford as a guest of Isaiah Berlin, he drew the attention of the New Statesman. And they wrote, I quote from here, "In an age of barbarism, it is so pleasant, though it is a pleasant thought that anyone who penetrated to the back rooms of Blackwell's last week and spied a little white-haired man on the top of a stepladder would have seen a prime minister indulging in his favorite vice." Well, this was his dream in the beginning. This was the Institute of Higher Education. And the campus was initially located in a former immigrant hostel with the dean of students operating from a Bedouin tent on the lawn. The dream became reality, and this is Ben Gurion University in the Negev today. In 1997, I became the president's advisor on biotechnology. The president at that time was Avishai Braverman. And then later on, I became a general advisor on general matters, and of course, helped to serve under Professor Rivka Karami. Ben Gurion University is the only resident university in Israel, and currently there are 20,000 students, of which 53% are women. A historic event took place at Ben Gurion University in 1979, the peace treaty between President Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Menachem Begin was signed actually on the campus. Avishai Braverman, in building the campus, was quite a visionary. He persuaded the government to put infrastructure, roads and railways, and it's now possible to take a train from Tel Aviv and be on campus. The station is actually on the campus with it under an hour. But in addition to creating an institute, a university, he wanted to attract people to the Negev. So the idea was to create institutes that would attract really good talent. And something which I'll say a little bit about later was the creation of the National Institute for Biotechnology in the Negev. And in addition, he had the vision of building a science park for advanced technology, attracting industry down to the Negev. I want to concentrate on Sde Boker, BGU's second campus. Israel lies on the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe, where three of the Earth's major drylands converge. And drylands cover 41% of the Earth's land surface. And so making deserts productive and comfortable places is a major mission. And also to assess the greatest, to be aware of the greatest problem, which is to protect the limited water of the region. So research institutes were set up in the desert campus. And this title says it all: from the desert for the world. And the mission in the desert is to combat desertification and to take on the global challenges related to food security, water scarcity, and clean energy. So the research priorities for such an institute in the middle of the desert would include water and alternative energy in the context of promoting sustainability of dry land. Because 41% of the Earth's land mass is dry land, as I said, and is home to more than 2 billion people. By 2050, there will be 9.75 billion people in the world. The farmland needed to feed them lies in the arid and semi-arid regions. And water is one of the Earth's most crucial resources, but it is finite. So the Sde Boker campus was built using a different approach, a bioclimatic approach to desert architecture. The idea really was to create a building that was an envelope, so energy, a sealed envelope. You would let energy in through the windows and the doors. And then having got this sealed envelope, you had to decide, it was heated by the sun's radiation, where would the building be turned, where would the windows be to get the greatest radiation? And south-facing windows give you the greatest radiation. They're large windows, while the north ones, which are for cooling, are smaller. But they're also tilted, because as the sun comes up, you don't want to boil the house too soon. The Blaustein Institutes for Desert Research there were three of them: agriculture and biotechnology for drylands, dryland environmental research, and one which I want to say a little bit about in a moment, the Zuckerberg Institute for Water Research. That is the same Roy Zuckerberg that funds the Brooks Scholarship. Earth is known as the blue planet. 71% of the Earth is covered with water, but only 1 to 2% is suitable for human use. And over 29% of people in the world at the moment do not have access to safe drinking water, which is a basic human right. Now, I'd like to show a film about the Zuckerberg Institute to give you a flavor of what's going on there. Now.
Water in Israel, as in the entire Middle East, is a scarce resource. We already consume more than God provides us with, more than nature gives us. In the Zuckerberg Institute for Water Research, we accommodate all these disciplines in order to be able to come up with what's necessary to produce not just enough water, but adequate quality of water.
In arid and semi-arid areas, gray water are becoming a very important source for yard irrigation in private homes. Gray water are all the water in the house except the water coming from the toilet and from the kitchen. This composes a lot of water that can be used. If we can use the gray water for yard irrigation, that would be a tremendous save. The problem with gray water is their origin. So they're coming from your home, so you're using chemicals and with pathogens that are associated with humans. And we're trying to see whether gray water can pose a health hazard when you're using it for yard irrigation. In Israel, for instance, it is not allowed to use gray water. So if you want to legislate it, you have to prove it does not pose a health hazard. So that's what we're trying to do. If we can establish that gray water are not a health hazard, then they could be a very important means for water conservation throughout the world for private homes.
We managed to bridge between what is available and the demand by producing water. We close the gap by treating water and coming up with new water based on innovations, findings, and advanced water technologies.
In our research, we try to improve the lifetime of reverse osmosis membranes. How do we do that? By looking better operational conditions. We are looking for better cleaning agents, and by modifying the membrane surface with this gel nanopolymeric layer for reducing biofilm formation. This nanopolymeric layer is able to reduce biofilm formation on the membrane, but still retain the performance of the reverse osmosis membrane. Furthermore, this layer is extending the life cycle of the membrane, making the water cost most likely lower and increase the accessibility of clean water to the population. This technology also leads us to improve water filtration membranes by 180%, which we are now applying for intellectual property, which can be used in the future.
The Institute accommodates not just an Israeli scientist and graduate students, but also students coming from all over the world. In addition, we opened ourselves toward the industrial world. We accommodate together water sciences with water engineering. With that, we became attractive to the water industry.
Billions of dollars are being invested to understand the processes that are controlling climate change, global warming, and to better predict what will be in the future. And what we are doing is we are providing tools for much more realistic prediction in large sections of our world. In addition to discussions on the theoretical stuff, we are traveling to Africa, going to a rural village, basically out of nowhere, without any running water, without any sanitation and so on. And we are trying to help them to do different water-related things, such as drilling wells, developing rainwater catchment systems. Also, we are trying to do some educational activity to teach the kids about sanitation, about the importance of clean water. It's very, very important for the students because it's helped them to understand what is going on with more than 2.5 billion people around the world. It's a great combination of cutting-edge science and assistance to other people in general and developing countries in particular. And I feel lucky to be a faculty member here at the Zuckerberg Institute for Water Research.
Regarding the future, we must come up with additional novel innovations that will lead to more advanced water technologies, that we shall be able to create affordable amount of water with adequate water quality. All major water resources in Israel and in the Middle East are cross-border water resources. We have to share what we have, and we shall have to share what we don't have, the future water that we shall produce.
Video, they talked about desalination, and just quickly about that. So desalination, you probably know, works by what we call reverse osmosis. So osmosis, but those of you who could remember back to your school days will remember that if you have a U-tube here and a semi-permeable membrane, you have a salt solution on one side and water on the other, the water flows into the salt solution, and that you get this difference. In reverse osmosis, you actually put pressure on one side and force the water through, leaving the salt behind. But there's a problem. The main problem that has held the field up for years has been the microorganisms that are in the seawater that grow on these filters. And so that means you have to stop the process, clean the filters, usually chemically, and then restart it. That makes it very expensive. But at the Zuckerberg Institute, they actually discovered a new kind of filter, the one shown here. So they took lava from rocks, they took lava, volcanic lava, which is sort of rocks, and they found that this would act as a filter. So the seawater is pumped through it. The microorganisms are held in the rocks. And then finally, when you want to clean it, you just blow air through. The microorganisms float to the surface and they float off. They can be cleaned. This is a spectacular way of actually making it much cheaper to have desalination and almost has a continuous process. And I show here the Scientific American, as 5 years ago, even acknowledged that Israel proves the desalination era is here. And the Sorek sort of desalination plant produces enough in one day for roughly 6 to 10 million people. And roughly, we're saying 6 additional ones like this are coming online somewhere in the world every year. But perhaps the greatest contribution of Israel's water technology to the world is in the so-called drip irrigation. And you can see here, it can be very sophisticated. You can have button drippers. So you can have a computer that tells you how much drops you want to go on each particular, this could be lettuces here on the left. Or you could have it like a Nepal farmer there, just using it, having holes in the water, drip irrigation. And actually in Israel, they talk about the crop per drop, because this is such an efficient way of increasing crop production and also of decreasing the amount of water you use. And currently, it's used in 110 countries worldwide. India and China have been major users of it. And but now it turns out that the USA are suddenly discovering that they have a use for it. And in California, Ben Gurion University partnered with the Conway Preservation Institute there and NetAFIM, and they actually decided they would use this technology to grow rice. And that has tremendous advantage for the people who have to pick the rice. Because before, when you have flooded fields, you have lots and lots of rats. So it makes it very unhealthy and difficult to work in. So the crop savings, the crop increased and the water savings were significant. And now in California, let's just look at what they're doing with dates. So California plants 53 trees per acre, date trees, and Israel only 45. The Californian yield is 70 kilograms of dates per tree, but the Israeli one is 120 kilograms. So they're now using drip irrigation in California for their date production, as opposed to flooding, as it used to happen in the past. Israel also, in using its technology, has increased sevenfold its agricultural output over the last 7 years, with hardly any increase in the amount of water used. You probably know that Israel invented the cherry tomatoes. They have the sweetest tomato in the world and the smallest tomato in the world. And all of that comes out of trying to increase yields and crop quality by sort of mixing mixing varieties. How about this? Something in there which is really quite spectacular, the Yatir forest in the Negev, the development of drought-resistant cypress trees. So to grow a forest in an area with an annual rainfall of 270 millimeters of water, that's pure magic. And Israel entered the 21st century with a net gain in the number of trees. And the story gets better. In the Negev, there are underground saline waters, 50 to 100 feet below the surface. They are roughly 104 degrees, and they're about 1/10 of the salinity of seawater. And you can grow crops you can grow crops in this water. So it's very easy to grow crops, and they don't mind being stressed a bit. So here you can see melons, pomegranates, tomatoes, melons. You can grow lots of fish. So fish farming becomes viable using the salty water. There's even a desert winery from the grapes that they've grown in the Negev. And of course, believe it or not, you can also grow water lilies in the desert, and I've seen them. The Americans took this to heart and said that we must radically rethink agriculture for the 21st century. And part of the answer is the scale up of drylands and saline agriculture, as we have just been describing. In the film, we also saw something about cleaning domestic grey water. Just to remind you, grey water is the water derived from domestic use, excluding toilet water. And it's divided into two: light grey water, which includes shower and water from sinks, and dark grey water, water from washing machines and kitchen sinks, because that probably contains more pollutants. And Israel's brilliant approach to water reuse is to have a strategy to use the water for what you want to intend it. So here, for instance, in Beersheba, a city of roughly 200,000 people, they use this domestic water, they recycle it to use it on potato and onion fields, so the right quality. And I can say that desalinated water in the Negev, 98% of the water that's used for domestic use is desalinated. And a satellite image of the so-called real green line shows the innovation of Israel in its desert studies. And you can see this is a green line which shows you just where the land is fertile. And look at the sharp line that divides the Sinai desert from the Negev desert. So it's quite clear that the use of this water is a tremendous learning experience for us all to watch what's happening. So as around the world, we know that water is scarce. We must learn, I think, from Israel's example. We must use 21st century thinking and 21st century technology so that we can tackle the water challenges. And Israel is showing us what these challenges look like and how we might solve them. And when it comes to alternative energy, solar power for clean electricity production, at Sde Boker you have the largest solar concentrating dish in the world. And Israel at the moment only has about 8% of its solar electricity feeding into the main grid, but it's hoped to increase that by 2025. But there are problems with solar energy. First of all, the photovoltaic cells that convert sunlight to electricity are not very efficient. They're about 20% efficient at the moment. We need to double that or even more. Then the material that makes around the solar panels, that only has a lifetime of about 20 years, and then it becomes a pollutant. So we need to improve those materials. So what we can say is that Israeli scientists are providing real solutions to real world problems. The water shortage, for instance, caused by famine and political instability. What is the solution? Focus on sustainable water resource management, advances in desalination water and reclamation technologies. What about food security? Well, there is an increasing pressure on arable land and there's continued population growth. The solution must be to adopt crops for desert climate and the use of saline water in growing a range of crops. And here's something that caught my eye recently, the zero discharge system, which supports desert aquaculture. So in here, there's a fish are grown in here. There's biological filters, which are developed, specially developed bacteria to treat water. So it's a closed system and it can be used anywhere in the world. When it comes to warming climates, and it's very topical today because of the conference that's happening in Scotland, increasing the number of people experiencing high temperatures. So the solution, develop building techniques, as we saw in the desert there, and materials for the desert heat and sun. And when it comes to clean energy, we have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. We must develop new sources of clean energy. And the solutions, solar energy, biofuels, and novel nanotechnologies. Artificial intelligence and machine learning can also help us in this. And here's something that you might find quite interesting. At the moment, in Israel, Google is conducting an experiment where it's looking at all the traffic system in both Beersheba and Haifa with a view to improving flow of traffic. And so far, it's been able to have a 10 to 20% reduction in fuel and fuel consumption and delay times. So a lot of technology is coming out of Israel, and it actually happened 50,000 years ago. When our ancestors moved from Africa into Eurasia, they went through the Negev. And there in the Negev recently have been found some stone tools. This was the new technology that was going to spread with humans as they took over the world. But today, there is different kinds of technology. And we find that Israel is at the forefront of medical device innovations and is saving lives worldwide. So the number of patents that's been granted in Israel is phenomenal per capita. And I've just put here three of products that you may have come across. The baby sense monitor, produced in, I think, 1991, which senses the breathing of the baby. The PillCam, which is an ingestible camera. I'll say something about that in a minute. And stents. Israel has been a leader in providing stents. But you don't always need great technology. I remind you that amniocentesis was discovered in Israel by Leo Sachs in 1956. And it was used at the time to determine the sex of a baby. Nowadays, it's used to try and look for fetal abnormalities. Endoscopy, which is a branch of medicine in which a small camera is mounted at the end of a long holder, is put into through an opening. And this is what it looks like. It's quite clumsy. Israel produced the first ingestible camera for disease detection. So you just swallow it, the size of a pill, and it's now used diagnostically every year for 200,000 patients. Currently, our own NHS here is doing a study with something like 11,000 patients to look for bowel cancer. And so you swallow the pill, you have a shoulder, a bag that has a receiver in it, the information is passed to the shoulder bag, you hand that in. And that became necessary because the COVID crisis in the UK stopped hospital admissions. And this was one way in which Israel has made a significant contribution. And the COVID crisis was also a wonderful way of using Israel as a laboratory for the world. So it has a national health system, one of the largest integrated digitized systems. So it knows everyone in the country. It knows where they are. So it made a deal with Pfizer to serve as a pilot. It would send the information to WHO and also send it to Pfizer at the same time. The result of that, Israel, as we know, became an international leader in vaccinating people. And by April 2021, the program looked fantastic. 3 months after the first vaccination, 85% of the people above 60 years of age vaccinated. Life, it looked like it was going back to normal. Tony Fauci said, I often use Israel as a prototype of what actually goes right. But then the grim warning comes from Israel by August. The vaccination blunts, but does not defeat Delta, the new virus that had come into the new variant of the virus that was now circulating. So Israel produced data which show that the decay of the vaccine protection over time goes from 90% after the 2 double dose down to about 30 to 40% after 5 or 6 months. You still get protection from substantial protection from serious disease, but you're losing a lot of your immune defense. So Israel becomes the first nation to offer a 3rd dose of vaccine to adults over 40, and it published the data in the New England Journal of Medicine in September 2021. And the rest of the world took note. The BBC said, what Israel tells us about the way out of the pandemic. The EU recommended a booster dose, as did the FDA. There are many technologies coming out of Israel, but Israel is also a leader in stem cell research. And one of the projects that I find very fascinating is regenerative medicine, which is bone grafting. And here the idea is to take adipose tissue, stem cells, turn them into bone cells and inject them. So just think that's going to be a tremendous way of having new bone grafts. The microbiome is another of Israel's pioneering research projects for human health. So just to put you in the picture about this, We have about 10 to the 14th, and for those of you that don't feel comfortable with that, that's 1 with 14 noughts after it, 10 to the 14th cells in our body. At least 50% are bacteria. And those bacterial cells are called a microbiome. They're a vast array of microbes. And the gut microbiome is particularly important. Just putting back the microphone. The gut microbiome is particularly important and is involved in many disease states. So they found, for instance, the gut microbiome, and that's analyzing huge numbers of microbes. So there's a huge amount of data analysis. This is really big data. But you can see obesity, diabetes type 1, cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, and so on. Autism, mood disorders, mental health conditions, and sleep. All of these can be affected by your gut, the microbiome in the gut. And we're beginning to understand how that happens. But in addition, it's also important in animals. The gut microbiome in animals is connected with the quality of the milk you get from cows, and also the environmental and climate effects, how much burping the cow does of methane. So here's something that's quite interesting. So Professor Elinav and Professor Siegel's groups at the Weizmann, they're really pioneers of the microbiome. They do many interesting studies, but here's one that might appeal to you. They wanted to find out what is the healthy food for each of us individually. Each of us reacts differently to the same food. Our microbiomes are slightly different. And so they want to find out, in diabetes, can we look at your individual gut microbiome and work out the best treatment for you? At Ben Gurion University, people are working on the microbiome too. They're looking at what do artificial sweeteners do to your gut microbiome. And they found 3 here that they studied, which is saccharin, sucralose, and aspartame, which seem to interfere with the gut microbiome in some way. Clearly, that deserves further studies. And then there's studies on probiotics. How do these affect the gut microbiome? Well, today, it won't be long before we can quantify the effects of all of this on diet. And one I particularly want to draw to your attention because of the climate change issues is the gut microbiome for the cow. So the microbiome is responsible in the cow for the production of one of the most potent greenhouse gases, which is methane. Methane accounts for 27% of the greenhouse gases at the moment. And so it's a really major effect. It doesn't last as long as carbon dioxide, but it heats up much more quickly. 3 months ago in this country, the Times reports the new mission, how to stop cows burping greenhouse gases. In America, they've even tried things with trying to feed cows seaweed to see if that makes the cow happy. And so we have here a happy microbiome cow. The work on the cow was done in the National Institute for Biotechnology in Negev, which I've referred to a couple of times, something that I worked for about 20 years to help create. It has a mission to plant the scientific seeds that lead to the commercialization of innovative and groundbreaking drugs, to build the Negev, and also to play a leading part in maintaining the excellence of Ben Gurion University. And I've used here the words in the mission to plant, because the current president of Ben Gurion University, Professor Daniel Chamovitz, is a world-famous botanist. So the plant was originally, if you need to build the Negev, this is the kind of things that you need to do. But it wasn't an easy ride always to build this in the Negev. So we had the vision, and Edgar de Picciotto at the World Bank Economic Conference in Davos in 2001 put this as a concept. It was agreed by the Israeli Prime Minister. Ariel Sharon came down to Ben Gurion himself and assured Edgar de Picciotto and myself that this would happen. And then year after year after year, nothing happened until in the year 2007, Thomas Friedman, the well-known journalist, visits Israel and goes to Ben Gurion University. And he writes this headline, "Israel discovers oil." And he says to pay a visit to Ben Gurion and see these rooms buzzing with student innovators. These are the oil wells that don't run dry. Well, I made a copy of this immediately. I sent it to Edgar de Picciotto in Switzerland. He sent it to the prime minister and everyone he could think of. And within 2 or 3 weeks, the money was agreed from the government's contribution to start the National Institute. And it was one of Rivka Karmi's first achievements as the new president of Ben-Gurion University at that time. But developing the Negev also involves improving human health and providing access to affordable, high-quality healthcare. And the Soroka Hospital that was built there is affiliated with the university. But it was founded on the principle of multicultural healthcare, and it serves the whole region there from Eilat to Kiryat Gat, which is roughly 1 million people. And one of the success stories I'd like to share with you from the hospital and the NRBM concerns the Bedouin people. So the success has led to a reduction in infant mortality of 30%. That's a pretty amazing contribution. And the most common diseases that the Bedouins have arise from consanguinity, that's marriage within the family. So Rivka Karmi started it and Ohad Burke then continued it. They started the using advanced genetic methods to study the Bedouin population. And they found they could trace these diseases. They could then start a massive carrier program and tell people at the time, or stop people from having dead infants. So some of these diseases are also common in the Arab world, and there are implications for large communities throughout the Middle East. One of the things you must do if we want to change things is educate people. And Ben-Gurion University decided that it had actually to involve Bedouin students in. And so it has a dedicated financial grant to bring the Bedouin students in, and particularly also to protect women's rights in the Bedouin community. And many of the students that were trained at Ben-Gurion University actually during the COVID crisis went back to their village and could help the elders in the village understand exactly what the crisis was about. One Bedouin student that benefited from this is Yasmin Haj Amer, who was actually the Brooks student here in 2013, 2014. She went back after being at Brooks to continue teaching English, to inspire Bedouin children, particularly women, to think of going to a university. And the picture here is with Sandra and Yasmin when we went to visit her in her village of Kasefa. And there were all the children there. And one of the girls proudly pointed to this poster. And it says, if you can imagine it, you can create it. If you can dream it, you can become it. And the girl was telling me that she was going to go to a university. So let's end with some high technology examples from Israel. It's been a world leader in the development of microchips. Without the microchip, there would be no laptops. The Pentium microchip there started all of these laptops. It invented the USB memory stick. Much of the development of the revolutionary chip, as we call it, in 2020 for laptops took place in Israel. The MacBook Air, Mac Mini, MacBook Pro, all equipped with this chip. And here's something that you may not know that Israel also invented, the Google Suggest autocomplete. You're typing away and it suggests to you. Well, that's Google Israel. If it gives you the right answer, it's a brilliant Israeli invention. If it gives you the wrong answer, it's a Google invention. And what about cybersecurity success? Israel invented the firewall. The first commercial firewall was available. It's a leader in cybersecurity and second only to the US, what it's doing at the moment. And autonomous self-driving cars, that again was an Israeli invention. Waze, which some of you may be using, is also an Israeli invention, as is Get, which was Get taxis. So there's a lot that we're benefiting from the use of Israeli technology. And many of you may not realize that in 1983, at the Motorola Israel R&D, the first ideas of the mobile phone were developed. And today, most of the technology in your mobile phone can be traced back to Israeli engineering, from the tool that guards your mobile identity to your keyboard, to a new keyboard solution, if you want. And here is something that's just happening at the moment, which is Orcam, My Eye. This is a little voice-activated computer that clicks onto your glasses. And when you turn your head and point, it sees in the screen what's there, and it tells you. It will read to you, or you could even program it to see people. But if you have a menu there, it will read you the menu. You can say, read me the menu. If it's a newspaper, you can say, read me the headlines. It can differentiate what headlines are. So these are some fantastic Israeli inventions that are going to change our lives over here. So we have in Israel a country with investment in infrastructure and people, the ability to transform a desert, research and pioneering groundbreaking technologies, computer devices, engineering, cybersecurity, agriculture, and I haven't touched on many others. And I rather wonder what Mark Twain might make of Israel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond, for a very inspiring and very informative talk. So we have had a couple of questions come in. Could I just please ask everybody who would like to ask a question just to pop it into the Q&A or in the chat function, and I will try and monitor all the channels. So if we kind of start maybe with the first question that came in. Raymond, would you be able to say something about the scientific collaboration with Israel's neighbors, both before and after the Abraham Accords, please?
I think they did. I think it's quite clear that the scientific interactions are going to increase. There's nothing formal that's really been put out at the moment, but there's lots of expectations and there's lots of goodwill on both sides. It's only a matter of time before there'll be joint ventures, joint companies, and so on. But at the moment, there's nothing really that's concrete that I can share with you.
Okay, thank you very much. I had another question come through, whether you might be able to speculate on what the future holds for the Negev in terms of desertification, worst case, best case scenario.
Well, I think it's a tremendous story that's emerging from there. I think the desert is now being populated with people, with technology. I think Israel now has more water that it actually needs. It exports water. It's recently increased the amount of water it exports to Jordan. So I think that Israel, it's very, very much a self-sustained area. The economy is growing. It's very, very clear that most of the IT and satellite information is now happening in and around Israel, happening in the Negev. So I think the economy is great. I think there will be more towns built that will spring up there. So I think it's an example, actually, of what you can do with a desert, how you can make a desert productive, how you can make it livable, sustainable, and have a really good standard of living and healthcare.
Okay, thank you very much. And this related question that came through, how do you see Israel in 20 years from now?
In terms of?
Didn't specify.
I missed that word.
They didn't specify. The question was just simply, how do you see Israel in 20 years from now?
Well, I mean, if it continues its progress, it will be, I think, what I'd like to see in 20 years from now is technology will be much more advanced. There'll be lots more artificial intelligence. I think that Israel will expand, will make peace with lots of its neighbors, who will see the advantages of technology. So I see a really bright future, actually.
That's good. That's great. I had another question come through. What would you like to see come out of COP26 and then the next COP meeting? Is there anything specifically you would think about?
Well, COP slightly outside my remit here, but obviously I think that some of the things we've touched on here, reduction in fossil fuels, absolutely crucial if we want to go forward. Alternative forms of energy. And then at the same time, related to that will be solving the food problem and the water problem. So most of the problems that I've touched on here are relevant to the COP26 conference.
Indeed, they are. somebody was wondering whether you would be able to talk a little about any collaborations between Ben Gurion University and either Oxford University or Oxford Brookes University.
Well, there have been lots of collaborations between Ben Gurion University and Oxford. I mean, first of all, in the area of glycobiology, which is my own area, there was a huge interaction in the early days of the field. Oxford University has sent out lots of people to help teach courses there. There's been a lot of interaction on stem cells between Ben Gurion University and Oxford. I think it's still growing. I mean, we had the BIRACS, this is British-Israel Academic Exchange, which Matthew Gould started, and which Rivka Karmi was the Israeli chairman and I was the UK chairman. And it was one of the most successful programs that the UK has ever had in bringing technology and sharing technology with Israel, because Israel was a leader in stem cells, and Oxford was very much a part of that.
Thank you. I think that's kind of brought us to the end of the questions that have come through, but you probably can't see the chat function at the moment, but there have been many comments here thanking you for an informative session, for a very inspiring talk. And indeed, if I may, I would like to read one of the messages out. Raymond, you are BGU's greatest ambassador, and while you insisted on retiring, in quotes, you are ever my advisor also, from the President Danny Shamovitz.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll bring the session to an end then for today. Thank you again, Raymond, for a wonderful talk. And I hope that everybody will enjoy the rest of their evening. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Astrid.